Hey, I'm Dylan at Western Bike Works, and this is WTFWBW. What's the Fix Western Bike Works? Episode 11. This is our web series where we take your questions and we answer them, whether they be questions about cycling history, arcana, or technical questions. Today we're going to be going over axle standards. There's a proliferation of different axle standards, widths, and diameters these days, and we're going to go over those and start to kind of demystify those. First, a little bit of a historical perspective, looking at the front of the bike, the front hub, how it interfaces the fork. Traditionally, 100 millimeters was the width of that interface, so the width of where the lock nuts of the hub interface the inner part of the dropout. And 9 millimeters was the diameter of that axle. On the back of the bike, road bikes traditionally used 126 millimeters for the width of the hub, and that's also the width of the frame in the back, and they used a 10 millimeter diameter axle. Now, when we started to cram more and more gears onto the back of the bike, we needed some more real estate in order to accommodate those. So road bikes went to 130 millimeters, still maintained that 10 millimeter diameter for the axle, but we got an additional 4 millimeters. When mountain bikes came out, a couple things happened. If you think of a triangle, the wider the base of the triangle, the more laterally strong that triangle is going to be. So when we got to mountain bikes, you wanted to have a stiff, laterally strong wheel, so they increased that overlock nut dimension, or the spacing on the back of the bike, to 135 millimeters. And by and large, that remained the standard for a long time. Now, when we started to get suspension forks, longer travel bikes, things subjected to a lot of lateral forces, we had to do some engineering changes. So first, looking at the front of the bike. Traditionally, still on mountain bikes, it was 100 millimeters with that 9 millimeter diameter axle. When we started getting downhill bikes, longer travel bikes, they looked for ways to make that interface a lot stiffer and a lot more robust. Some downhill bikes went to 110 millimeters for the width of the hub, and they increased the diameter of the axle to 20 millimeters. This is a massive axle, and it also became a through axle. So instead of having a quick release to attach the wheel to the fork, you've threaded that axle or somehow secured it all the way through the fork. So that was the 20 millimeter through axle. That's a little robust for a lot of applications. So what we saw lots of manufacturers doing for shorter travel bikes is playing around with the diameter and the spacing. So they went back to 100 millimeters for the spacing of that front hub or the front fork, and they went to a 15 millimeter through axle. So it's no longer a quick release. It's 15 millimeters, a little bit smaller. And that was good for some shorter travel applications. We're also seeing the through axle start to make an appearance for road and cyclocross applications. The 100 millimeter overlock nut dimension, or the width of the hub here, with a 15 millimeter through axle, but then we're also seeing manufacturers that are going to something kind of in between, a 12 millimeter axle. When we get to the back of the bike is when things get a little bit more complicated. So we started with that 135 millimeter overlock nut dimension with a 10 millimeter quick release style axle for mountain bikes. And in order to get a stronger, more robust, stiffer interface, they went to a through axle that was now 12 millimeters in diameter. Now, the overlock nut dimension didn't change, but what they did is they recessed the interface of the dropout 3.5 millimeters on either side to give an axle length overall, adding 7 millimeters, to 142. So that 142 by 12 diameter, that's telling you that there's a little recess on the inside face of the dropouts, and then a 12 millimeter through axle is what secures the wheel to the back of the bike. Now, some early downhill bikes used 150 millimeter overlock nut dimension with a through axle. The problem with that was it didn't have recesses on the inside face of the dropouts of the frame, so you kind of had to hold the wheel in place and try to put the through axle through there, and it wasn't very effective. So some long travel downhill bikes, same thing that they did to go to 142, now they've added 3.5 millimeters on either side, recesses in the frame, to give you a 157 millimeter overlock nut dimension with a 12 millimeter through axle. It's a little bit of overkill for short travel or medium travel bikes, but you might still encounter some downhill bikes that have that. So to put it bluntly, axle standards are multiplying faster than a pair of bunnies at a Barry White concert. So if you have any questions specifically about compatibility with your bicycle components, give our expert customer service staff a call, or visit our store, Northwest 17th and Lovejoy in downtown Portland, and now in the Tigard Triangle in Tigard, Oregon. Thanks for watching WTF WBW.